Evening or good afternoon or even good morning, depending on where you're joining us from. This is Phi Beta Kappa's call to service, the keynote program of our Key into Public Service convening. I'm Fred Lawrence, Secretary and CEO of the Phi Beta Kappa Society, and we're delighted to have all of you with us for this program. As America's most prestigious academic honor society, Phi Beta Kappa champions the arts, natural sciences, social sciences, mathematics, all for their value to individuals, to communities, and indeed to our nation and our global community. Phi Beta Kappa members, including 17 United States presidents and now 42 Supreme Court justices, have demonstrated time and time again that pursuing excellence in the arts and sciences can open the door to a meaningful and a productive and an engaged life. A liberal arts and science education gives you the tools to thrive in careers that truly matter. At this time, as our nation seeks to rebuild from health, economic, and social crises, it's a particularly important time for current students and for recent graduates interested in careers with purpose, meaning, and impact to continue to consider careers in public service. There are recurring questions that students in the liberal arts thinking about public service will ask. How can you jumpstart a service career without any personal connections? What should you do now to make sure that the transition from campus to a public service career is easier? Are there particular skills and particular skill gaps from a liberal arts and sciences education that you should seek to acquire through internships or campus leadership positions? These are just some of the questions that our esteemed panelists will be answering today and engaging with today. I'm delighted that we are joined by Professor Paul Helmke, Dr. Amanda Johnson, and Congressman Andy Kim. They will help us explore, using their inspired own experiences, with career tips, practical suggestions geared specifically to liberal arts students as they were into significant public services careers as they have had. Before we begin this conversation, I do want to take a moment to recognize and congratulate the 20 remarkable recipients of our 2021 Key into Public Service scholarships, $5,000 awards for liberal arts and sciences students who are demonstrating interest in transitioning from campus into careers in public service. These accomplished students truly stand out for their academic breadth and depth, even among the many, many impressive applicants we had from our 290 Phi Beta Kappa campuses. At this time, when the value of expertise, experience, and service is very clear, perhaps never been clearer, Phi Beta Kappa applauds the service scholars for their pursuit of academic excellence in the public interest. Congratulations to you, to your families, to your mentors, and to your institutions. And now to the business of the night. It's my great pleasure to welcome our three panelists. In alphabetical order, I'll begin with Paul Helmke. Paul is a professor of practice at Indiana University's O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. He directs IU's Civic Leaders Center, a living learning center for students of all majors who are dedicated to leading for the greater good. He is the former president of the Brady Campaign to prevent gun violence, former president of the U.S. Conference of Mayors, and a former three-term mayor of Fort Wayne, Indiana, Indiana's second largest city. As mayor of Fort Wayne, he received national attention for his program of community-oriented government and also served on federal cabinet advisory committees dealing with violence against women and school-to-work transitions. Paul's a proud Phi Beta Kappa member from Indiana University, where he majored in government and served as student body president during the late 1960s, a time of great student activism and protest. Indeed, there are many who would say that the students of today have more in common with the students of the late 60s and early 70s than either of us does of the group that came in between. So I think there's great relevance to Paul's experience. After IU, he earned his law degree at Yale Law School. So Paul, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Dr. Amanda K. Johnson is the Assistant Vice President of Care Models in the Office of Ambulatory Care and Population Health for New York City Health and Hospitals, where she leads a team providing innovative care for people exposed to the criminal justice system, experiencing homelessness, or facing other structural barriers that impede access to health care. There, she directs New York City's Test and Trace Core Take Care pillar, which provides supported isolation and quarantine options to COVID-19 patients and contacts. She also leads Aftercare, a new initiative to connect people living with long COVID with physical, mental, financial, and social resources that they dearly need. On top of all that, as if it weren't enough, Dr. Johnson is a practicing physician, clinical assistant professor at NYU's Langone School of Medicine. Amanda became a member of Phi Beta Kappa at Stanford University, where she earned a BA with honors and distinction in human biology and Spanish, as well as a minor in African and African American studies. She received her medical degree from Harvard Medical School and her MBA from Harvard Business School. Last but certainly not least is Congressman Andy Kim from the New Jersey 3rd District. He is one of just 18 Asian Americans currently holding office in the legislative branch and has played an important role in championing the recently passed COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act that addresses the rise in violence against the AAPI community. Many of us will remember Congressman Kim earlier this year on his hands and knees cleaning up trash in the Capitol building after January 6th, proving what it means to lead by example. Prior to serving in the House of Representatives, Congressman Kim has worked as a career public servant under both Republicans and Democrats. He served in the United States Agency for International Development, the USAID, the Pentagon, the State Department, the White House National Security Council, and in Afghanistan as an advisor to Generals Petraeus and Allen. Congressman Kim earned Phi Beta Kappa distinction at the University of Chicago, where he majored in political science after transferring from Deep Springs College. He studied international affairs at Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar and was also a Truman Scholar. Now, for all of you joining us, if you have questions for any of our wonderful panelists this evening, please type it into the chat function on the YouTube live stream. We'll try to get to as many of those as we possibly can as the evening progresses. I also encourage you to carry the conversation out onto Twitter. Please use the hashtag PBK Public Service. And now let's jump in. Paul, I'm gonna start with you. As I mentioned, you served as a student body president in the late 60s, 69, 70 year,
That's correct.
if I recall, which culminates in Cambodia Spring and Kent State and Jackson State and tumultuous moments in American history, great uncertainty and change. I'm sure that nobody at that time asked you, how is this going to be a career move? But I'm going to ask you that. How do you think your liberal arts background as an undergraduate affected your activism? And how did your career, if you will, in activism affect the career in public service that became your path?
Right. Well, first, thank you for inviting me again. Congratulations to the scholarship winners, and thanks to all the attendees today. Yeah, the late 60s were a crazy time. And I was, as you said, a government political science major. I was a history minor. So I was taking classes on political philosophy. I was taking a very rudimentary sort of, punch card, feed it into the computer that's the size of a living room, to do voter analysis type classes. I was taking history classes on protest and civil rights movement and anti-war movement. So all of those sort of got me involved in student politics. It was, why do people do what they do? What instills a sense of political obligation in individuals? I actually wrote I think my honors thesis on that. I did other papers on did the votes on the Gun Control Act of 1968, which created the prohibited purchaser system. How did that affect the 1968 elections? I had to write Senate candidates from around the country to get their literature and find out their stance and to get their responses. There was no internet to do that.
You didn't just go online?
It was a lot harder, but so when I was looking at issues on our campus, that all sort of helped because how can you get people inspired? How can you get people motivated? What's going to work successfully? And whether it's going back to sort of Aristotle's discussions on what form of government is the best, or reading Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail on sort of the 4 steps for a successful protest. Those were things that I was able to use right then and there. And there's nothing like standing on the top of a car speaking to 10,000 people, many of whom are yelling back at you and throwing things, and half of whom are high on something, to make you understand that politics in real life is different than it is in the books sometimes. So I learned, the classes in the liberal arts education were meaningful then, but the experience is something that came, it has affected all my life. And there's really sort of three things that I look back on. One is you learn to deal with people. In class, you're getting the policy and you're learning what's happened before, the philosophy, the policy. But when you're active in an organization, when you're leading a march, when you're involved in protests, you learn about people. And I think that's a crucial thing. To what makes them tick, what gets them riled up, how can somebody really take something and tell it the wrong way? How can somebody speak up and get it on the right track? How do people work differently in groups than they do on a one-on-one basis? And to me, people are still one of the great mysteries of life and one of the fascinations of public service. It's trying to figure out, again, what they do with things. So being active as an undergrad really helped me understand people somewhat, and makes me still curious on how people do things. I think the second thing was that it helped me deal with the issue of pressure. It's when you get in public service, all of a sudden you're getting pushed at from all sides. And I know when I got elected mayor, it's sort of like you get elected mayor, everybody's not everybody, but all your supporters are happy, and then the first decision you make, I appointed person A police chief, not person B. Person B's mad at me now, and all of a sudden, every stand you take, every decision you make, somebody dislikes. But I learned that as a student too. All of a sudden, I'm trying to convince the administrators that they need to listen to students. I've got some students say I'm not going far enough. Other students say I'm going too far. I'm hearing from my father and my grandfather back home. They're hearing friends saying, "What's your crazy radical son doing? We thought he was a good guy," and you're dealing with all that kind of pressure. And so you have to develop a thick skin, but you have to decide for yourself what's the right thing to do, and then stand by your decisions. You've got to have that kind of core. I think the last thing is you realize you have a sense of purpose. What is your individual purpose? What's the in life? What are you good at? What do you like doing? Where can you make a difference on things? And it can be just the purpose of the demonstration you're leading. What are we trying to accomplish? But what are we trying to do long range for people, for the community, for the student body, for whoever it is you're serving? And those are all lessons I got from the 60s. I think it's great to see the activism that we're seeing today. There's always a tension in American society, and I think that's good. We've got high ideals. We don't live up to them. And we make progress by having that creative tension with protest, with activism. So I learned that a long time ago, and I keep trying to do that still today.
People, purpose, and pressure. That's three good lessons coming out of your undergraduate career. I can also tell you, as a former university president, I viewed my student body presidents as my essential partner. Some of them worked exactly as I wanted, some less so, but we were always in collaboration together, and that's how you start to move the ball forward.
Great.
Amanda Johnson. So Paul was in the social sciences. You were in everything but the social sciences. You double majored in biology and Spanish, and then have a minor in the humanities as well, African American history. So I guess a couple of related questions. What made you decide to do that for your undergraduate program? And how would you say that has influenced your approach in developing community-based approaches to healthcare and to public health? Is it a straight line, or are there a lot of zigs and zags between the young double major with an intriguing minor and then the very responsible position with New York City's Health and Hospitals Corporation that you have today?
Thank you, Fred. And I will say that it actually came together far more cleanly than I would have imagined, but not necessarily in the way that I would have expected at the time. And before I start, I just want to echo the appreciation to the Phi Beta Kappa Society and our attendees for joining us today, and my extreme congratulations to our public service scholars. So in terms of how I shaped my undergraduate career, I will go into kind of their linkages to my current career, from concrete to the most abstract. I think from a very early age, I realized that I wanted to study Spanish. It was essential to study Spanish. And part of this is born out of growing up in California at a very young age, answering the telephones. These were landlines back in the day, and having someone greet me in Spanish and not really being able to communicate on their own terms that they had dialed the wrong number. It seems like it's something that's very simple, but from a very early age, it demonstrated that our country is diverse. And it's incumbent on those of us to try and meet people where they are and to communicate in ways that make sense to them. And so by double majoring in Spanish, I was continuing training in foreign language that I began in middle school for the express purpose of being able to communicate with my patients who spoke Spanish. And that has been of great utility to every healthcare setting that I've worked in, from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, my hometown, to San Francisco, Oakland, Boston, and now here in New York City. So on a very, very concrete level, the humanities afforded me the tools I needed to communicate with a large swath of the population. Kind of moving up from there, the African-American Studies minor was actually, I won't say by accident, but in the remaining coursework units that I had available to me, I took many classes in dance and drama. They all seemed to have a focus on the diaspora and on the continent. And so I was able to weave those together into the African-American Studies minor. I think that fostered an appreciation for the value of storytelling. And that has been quite essential to both the public health response as well as the development of care models. So the minor was both a combination of theory, practice, history, really understanding what are some of the foundations of the canon, but being able to see how storytelling was important in drama allowed me to become a better storyteller during the onset of the pandemic, when it suddenly became my job to go on television, something I did not expect to be doing in college, not expect to be doing from medical school, and talk to people about why this is important. And I learned that you can tell a good story about why household transmission is so dangerous and so deadly. You can tell a good story about how long COVID will impact people's ability to return to work and actually creates this crisis of disability in our country with a really unpredictable course. And being able to calibrate the story that I told to how it was carried in news articles, press releases, social media clips later, really conveyed to me why it's helpful to be able to tie together some of these really complex concepts into a narrative. I knew that I did a good job when I could see that story being preserved across multiple different tellers, much in the way that the reasons we have oral traditions is to be able to pass down these stories from generation to generation from people who weren't there to immediately experience or live it. I would also say that just having to do drama and dance helps one get a basic sense of their bearings if they're going to be in front of a camera, if they're going to be on stage, you know, what stage right, stage left, remembering how to read a teleprompter, those types of things. And then probably at its most abstract level, the importance of the humanities became profoundly real for me as the country in the midst of the pandemic found itself on the cusp of this racial reckoning. And so while we're trying to talk to the public about mRNA and long COVID and what's a case versus a contact, how is isolation different from quarantine, you find yourself within institutions and across city agencies trying to understand and communicate to people how equity is different from disparity and what anti-racist practice is versus what is racist versus what is neutral, what is structural racism versus what is interpersonal racism, what is stigma and how does it operate? And so just having the experience of debating and refining some of those terms and language used to convey those concepts in my liberal arts education, I found myself utilizing that with coworkers, with the public, as we brought some of these programs to bear and are still doing so.
Kierkegaard famously said, life has to be lived forward and understood backward. I'm sure that if I had taken a young undergraduate taking a dance class aside and said, this is going to be really important in the middle of a once in a century pandemic when you're on television, you wouldn't exactly have flashed on that. And yet that's how it all kind of came together and advances the science work then at the same time and fleshes out a public health profile, not just in the labs and the offices, but in the television studios, which becomes an important part of your public health work during this time, doesn't it? Congressman Kim, you have an intriguing expression that caught my attention. You said when you work in government or public service, your job is to solve problems. A big part of that is knowing how to ask the right questions. So I wonder how you think your liberal arts background at two very different institutions has helped you ask the right questions and therefore get things done and serve your constituents, which at the end of the day is your obligation as a member of the United States Congress.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks again for having me, and so great to be on this program with everyone. You're right. I went to two very different undergraduate programs. I did 2 years at a pretty unique place called Deep Springs College, which has only 26 students, and you work and live on a cattle ranch in the California desert, and while you also study the great books. And then I went to the University of Chicago, and both of these schools, what connected them for me was that these schools were focused in on depth, not just breadth. And it very much was about asking the right questions and figuring out how to get to the core of what it is you're trying to actually address. So, I think about that a lot, with the work that I do still. I'm always asking myself, am I asking the right question? Am I coming at this from the right way? For instance, I served on the select committee on the coronavirus crisis last year during the start of the pandemic through some of the darkest days in our country's modern history. And there's so many different issues that are in front of you, so many different threads and rabbit holes you can go down of all these different problems that are out there. But I always tried to make certain that I stayed focused on what I thought were some of the key questions that were kind of my North Star. So for instance, just staying focused on this question of what is it going to take for us to actually end this pandemic? And just really trying to work backwards from there. And, that was something that allowed me to make sure that I wasn't just approaching this crisis through a nearsighted lens. I don't have to tell you all how nearsighted our politics can be and how reactionary it can be. I mean, so much of the work that we do, it feels like you're just taking it one day at a time, or frankly, like one tweet at a time. And that's just not the right way to be able to think strategically. So when you ask that question, what is it actually going to take to end the pandemic? That's what got me thinking back in April and May of last year about the challenges that we would face in terms of the distribution of an eventual vaccine. That was something that we were able to think through very early on and say that that's going to be a massive challenge that we're going to face down the road. It was not necessarily something we were facing right then and there, but it allowed us to get some of the machinery in place and ask, and press these questions to the right people and think through that. The other aspect of it is, to your point, it's about solving problems. And this is something that I find challenging with the experience that I have in government, but frankly, in any sector, which is that there's a difference in my mind between doing something and solving a problem. And I experience this again every day where, for instance, like climate change or hunger. I, for one, have been doing a lot of work, for instance, on hunger, trying to end hunger in my district across this country. I find it ridiculous that and shameful that in this day and age, in the richest, most powerful country in the world, that we have millions of people that are hungry every day. In my district alone, we estimate about 50 to 60,000 people, around 10 to 20,000 kids in my district are hungry every day. The question is yes, we're doing things. We are engaged on actions, whether that's SNAP or other types of actions. But the question is that what we want to do, or do we actually want to end it? Do we actually want to solve this problem? Same thing with climate change. No doubt the infrastructure bill we're trying to push on is trying to address some of these problems. But the question is, are we actually trying to solve it? Are we actually trying to meaningfully get at the root of what it is we're trying to do? And I think too often in government, or in frankly a lot of other work, we tend to lose sight of what it means to actually solve a problem, what it actually means to to get to the root of it and not just do something and show some action, but to actually solve it, right? And I think that that's where I get it. But what it also shows me is that my work at Deep Springs in particular, when I was doing a lot of work on the ranch and doing a lot of work with my hands, it taught me a lot that, you know, oftentimes I've never encountered a situation where there's only one way to solve a problem. You know, there is a lot there. I also learned a lot of humility in the work, because a lot of times I was trying to learn things that I didn't know, or I realized other people had knowledge that I didn't have, and I should learn to address that. And, you know, I think that that's important to recognize and be okay with the idea that you don't have all the answers, and that's okay. And you can work together, and you have that humility, you approach that with the right kind of mindset. So that's kind of where my education that I had, my liberal arts education, you know, taught me a lot of those skill sets that really have been the North Star for me in the work that I'm doing, trying to keep me focused on the bigger picture.
Making sure you're asking the right question, moving the ball forward, and not to forget that none of us is as smart as all of us, and the ability to work together with others who will have pieces of the puzzle that we may not have. Thinking of getting things done, focusing on solving problems. You know, Paul, the joke is that of all the people in government leadership positions, mayors actually have to do stuff. There's no place to hide when you're a mayor. If there's a snowstorm, if there's a flood, if there's something, God forbid, much more serious, it falls on the mayor's desk. And not just his desk, it falls in his whole life, 24/7. There is no going off duty as the mayor. And you were a 3-term mayor, but you were also involved in national organizations of mayors, had leadership positions there. One of our key and public service scholars is interested in being a mayor of a city. So this would be the time for you to say that's a great thing. I'm not feeding you here too much, but don't want to discourage him, because I'm sure there were parts of the day that made you frustrated, but I'm sure there were parts that also were quite uplifting. Here's the thing I want to ask you though. When you think about your undergraduate background, but now flashing forward to our students' undergraduate backgrounds. So what are the skills that you think it's important for them to acquire in addition to the classes that they take? And I wonder if you can point us to an example of a municipal leader whose innovative handling of, look, maybe something out of the pandemic that we've just been living with is a good example, an inspiring case study of looking at a problem, identifying it, and then figuring out how you take all those skills and apply them to what Congressman Kim talked about, solving problems, moving the ball forward.
Yeah, mayor is a great job. I love being mayor. It's not what I started out wanting to be. I'd actually ran for U.S. Congress, lost in a primary there was an open seat. Our congressman was a fellow by the name of Dan Quayle, and who went on to become a vice president.
Future Vice President Quayle, right.
And so there's an open seat, and my father had run for Congress the 2 years before Dan Quayle, had come close. Quayle ran the next time. I'd worked on his campaign. Then he decided after 4 years to run for U.S. Senate. So there's an open seat. I thought, got a good family name. I've been active in the community, young, energetic. But I ran against the long-term state senator, and I ran against a guy that had taken a job I had turned down with Quayle. A guy who Quayle didn't know, didn't work on his campaign. Quayle asked me to run and be his district office representative. I thought staff guys never go anywhere. I tried to help him find a replacement for me. Couldn't find anybody. He gets this guy that hadn't even voted in the election 2 years earlier. He ran then for the open seat too. His name's Dan Coates. He went on to be in Congress and Senate, ambassador to Germany, in Senate again, and then recently head of
national intelligence.
And national intelligence. So one of the lessons, by the way, is that, don't turn jobs from future vice presidents, maybe, but you still end up okay. So a few years later, they wanted somebody to run for mayor, and they enlisted me. But a lot like Representative Kim said, I think being able to ask the right questions is crucial. I learned very quickly that there was a ton I didn't know. I didn't know how the sewer system worked and all the chemical types, I'd go over to visit the water filtration plant and they'd explain these things to me. It's I was good at chemistry, but I barely know H2O from whatever else there is out there. So it's but when you're a mayor, you're running the sewer system, you're running the water system, you're in charge of the police department, you're doing economic development, you're doing housing, you're doing streets, you're doing parks, you're doing all these issues. And so you want to get good people around you. So, I mean, crucial thing is appoint good, smart people. And then I would ask them what I thought were hard-hitting, insightful questions. And if they gave me an answer that seemed legit, I'd let them go ahead. If they were obfuscating or backtracking or didn't seem to know what was going on, then I started to have concerns, and oftentimes that person had some creative outplacement in their job. So it's asking good questions is crucial. You don't know it all, but if you know enough to ask the right questions and evaluate the answers, that takes you a long way. The other thing is, once you've made a decision, I mean, and that's basically what the job of a mayor is in other things. You've got these issues, you've got to make a decision. And sometimes you have incomplete information. I get a lot of people that sit after I left office, Helmke, we disagreed with you, but at least you seem like you were honest, or we didn't agree with this or didn't agree with that, but you were good overall. And I said, well, in retrospect, I don't agree with everything I did, but I had to make decisions at a certain time based on limited knowledge. I couldn't just pontificate, write a letter to the editor, join, some other group. I had to make a decision. So you ask the good questions, you make the tough decisions, and then you've got to explain it to your constituents. You explain it to the city council, you explain it to the newspapers, you explain it to the people. And I think that's the crucial thing, learning how to communicate. And people are suspicious of government. They're suspicious of politicians and elected officials' motives. I think is clear, if you can be as clear as can be. Here's what we're doing. Here's why we're doing it. Here's what the upsides are. Here's what the downsides are. Here's when you're likely to see results. If you can communicate that well, then I think you're going to do a good job. There are too many politicians that I think just put their finger in the wind to see what the people are thinking. The good politician helps explain to the people what needs to be done, why it needs to be done, how you're going to do it. That's the communication skills that are crucial. Last point is on the skills, asking the questions, making the decisions, and communicating them. Last one is be willing to change. You're going to make mistakes. Things aren't going to work out. At the mayoral level, if you've got great political theory on privatization, but the private garbage company doesn't pick up the trash, you got to adjust. You got to do something different. If your policing programs aren't making the community safer, you got to adjust. And you've got to admit sometimes you made a mistake, sometimes it just didn't work out, and you've got to be willing to explain that to people too. And that's the scary thing about, I think, politics today is so many people look back and say, oh, 25 years ago you took this position, whoever, and so this is why oftentimes you don't have people with long histories that get elected to things anymore. I think we've changed that, obviously, with President Biden, but you've got to be able to adjust for things. But I love being mayor. In terms of COVID and mayoral examples, it's hard for me to pick one. Dr. Johnson probably might have a better sense on what's working well. I've heard good things about Eric Garcetti, the mayor of LA, and how he's handled things, although that apparently he caught some flack for closing some testing sites at one stage after some of the protests. But I think he's gotten some good results overall. I think the thing that people don't always appreciate is, I think mayors in all size communities across the country have tried to do their best with this. But last year was being hit with a perfect storm in a lot of ways. They got hit with COVID. They got hit with the economic issues resulting from COVID, and then the policing protests after the George Floyd murder, particularly people coming in the streets. And again, mayors, it's your community. You're dealing with the sick people. You're dealing with the closed businesses. You're dealing with the police department, and you've got to find something to do. But what I think's been encouraging is I think mayors, both Republicans and Democrats, have worked together to try to get best practices. What worked in community A? Will that be replicable in my community? And mayors have been sharing that. I checked in with some of my friends on the U.S. Conference of Mayor staff this afternoon just to see if there's any latest. They were on a Zoom call or getting ready for a Zoom call with the White House to plan a challenge to get people vaccinated and have communities basically compete against each other to see who's going to get the higher vaccination rates. Those are the sorts of things that I think mayors working together can do to make a difference. As to who did a good job, I think maybe in a couple of years when we look at all the results, we can get a better idea. It's the last thing on this. It's tough when you're mayor because while you are seeing the problems directly in your community, you don't always have the authority to deal with these things. There's a lot of state legislatures that have preempted local communities from making decisions on things like COVID. There are sometimes county health departments that the mayor has no control or no influence over. We've got a very decentralized health system in this country. That makes it tough. At the federal level, sometimes the federal government can be a good partner. Sometimes it gets in the way too on these things. But the mayors can't leave town and go away and run someplace. They've got to deal with the problem. And I think most of them have done their best to try to make things work despite all the challenges, both on the ground and in the governmental system.
And actually, it leads to to questions about COVID and lessons learned that, Amanda, I wanted to turn to you on. I think we're all really hopeful that we're at the last stages of this, and of course, different days bring different news. We don't know how much tunnel is left. There does appear to be light at the end of it, one way or the other. But that does bring us to thinking about lessons learned and what we can learn from should the situation arise in some future way. Hopefully not as severe, but to be prepared. So I wonder on two different levels. One is lessons you've learned as a matter of public health, that you've been sort of force-fed a set of experiences that are probably beyond what you could even have imagined, but risen to the occasion. So what lessons have you learned about the public health system and how we might want to be able to respond to things differently? And from the point of view of our students, what's the role for them as young consumers of, advocates for, and participants in public health as we move from this time into whatever comes next for us?
Yeah, so I think that probably the two big lessons learned will be encapsulated in the disclaimers that I must give. So in line with Professor Helmke's comments, when we talk about the public health system in the United States, there is the CDC, there is the State Department of Health with whom we coordinate, there's the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. And so I'm going to be speaking from the vantage point of the public health system in a large urban city, but it is very different across the country in terms of what the local public health policy it is and how it interacts with those state and federal levels. And then I'm actually, and would not characterize myself as a public health professional. I am a medical practitioner. I work in a healthcare delivery system. And I think one of the rifts that we've been trying to bridge in New York City, even before there was a pandemic, is this historical divergence that has occurred between the practice of medicine and public health. And do we love medicine? Do we love technology and medications and all of these things that we can do after the fact? And we've completely disinvested in the public health infrastructure that would have put us on a much better footing during a crisis of this magnitude. And then the last piece is that as much as I may be critical, I am very sympathetic to public health practitioners at all levels. So I think it'll be hard for me. I will still have some blind spots. And to that end, most of the advice I'm going to give to the public service scholars are all of these other policies that impact what public health is going to be able to achieve. So in terms of kind of starting at the structural level, the CDC, the financial investment that they are awarded has barely kept pace with inflation, and they award funds to the states. They've been doing this during a time where the scope of what the CDC is responsible for is far beyond communicable diseases and food inspection to encapsulate health equity, chronic diseases, preventive healthcare. And so we have kind of the same pot of funds on a inflation-adjusted basis to deal with an ever-increasing scope of problems. I think another issue that was clear and present to me during the pandemic, where I started as serving as interim chief medical officer for my health center. So I was very much in a healthcare operations role, not because of the pandemic. There just happened to be a pandemic during the time that I was in this particular leadership position. The challenges that I had didn't come from the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. Again, perhaps this is the sympathy or the fact that I had worked closely with them even before there was a pandemic. But our concerns were the availability of PPE. Our concerns were the availability of testing supplies and lab capacity so that we could run the tests. And the concern there is not being able to actually characterize the magnitude, distribution, or disparate impact of the foe that you're facing, of the pandemic before us. And we'll get a little bit into kind of solutions and why this is so important in just a moment. But the ability to have these supplies at the ready was not a problem that public health alone could solve. I think one of the things that people had the foresight to do incredibly well during the New York City response to the pandemic was their investment in information systems. So we were able to say during periods of low positivity, when community spread wasn't prevalent, where we had hotspots and where we needed to target resources, we could say what the demographics of that community were, what languages were spoken, what age groups were affected. We could be very, very targeted in our approach and have kind of a place-based response. And then during times where the entire city was affected, let's think about March and April of 2020. Let's think about the kind of fall, winter of this year. We had an information system that gave us great operational data. We could manage our workforce down to the person, down to the phone call to ensure that we could get through the ballooning number of cases that we were seeing on a daily basis. The information system piece stands out to me so much. And I think part of it is that we had to be so intentional about the systems that we were building because public health, much less medicine, has not had a digital health revolution. So we have to build information systems that allow you to take data that comes in big batches. We get a chunk of data from the state into a city database, and then we have to churn through it. But if you were dealing with any other information system, you trade those packets of data in real time. There's no such thing as an overnight batch process. Why would anyone do that? You just lose time. And you could think going forward, if you're trying to create a nimble and efficient system for responding to a pandemic, you would want to have more seamless integration between kind of city, state, and federal databases. You would want to be able to say, hey, this is a positive COVID case in someone who has been vaccinated. The testing database and the vaccine database is not the same database. So you have to be really intentional about getting that matched. And can you imagine not being able to match on a unique key for an individual, not being able to, you think it's person A in this system and you think person A1 in this system, but having to do that fuzzy matching is another toll on development and another task that our engineers really handled with aplomb. But we want a system that is going to be able to do that kind of smart responses. This is a COVID case and someone who's been vaccinated. Let's identify them, take an extra detailed contact tracing history, and let's sequence the particular specimen from that individual so that we understand what variants are emerging and what threats we need to be mindful of. So that's kind of the public health side of the lessons learned. I would say that all of the outward facing lessons are not really public health problems. And kind of my first bucket of reflections harkens back to what Congressman Kim had to say about, are we solving the right problem? I think, and this again is a testament to city government and mayors, to Professor Helmke's point before, is, it was an emergency and we did a lot of really wonderful things. People could not go out to get food because grocery stores were perceived as dangerous. Our workforce was decimated, but we could deliver millions of meals to people to their doorstep across 5 boroughs. We found that congregate settings, dorm-style homeless shelters were not a great place to live because that was an opportunity for the disease, for the virus to be transmitted. So we de-densified homeless shelters and gave people a room with a private bathrooms so that they could protect themselves against COVID. We did the same thing when it came to jails and prisons. We had this realization that, hey, maybe we didn't have to have people incarcerated for this period of time. So we were able to give them early release and return them to a stable living situation where there were co-located social services so that they stood a chance of having a graceful reentry into society. We provided cash assistance. We provided coverage for testing, treatment, isolation, quarantine, vaccination, so that gaps in our healthcare access programs, Medicaid, Medicare, commercial insurance, things I'm sure you're familiar with, didn't pose a threat to our ability to end the pandemic. We did all of this on a foundation where people have experienced systemic racism. They've accumulated the chronic disease burden that's a byproduct of our differential access to healthcare. We did this on the background of immigration policy that has made it incredibly challenging for people to come and seek care without fear, as much as we say that any of these services would not constitute a public charge, which was still a looming threat in many people's minds during 2020. But we were able to really plug into a lot of great emergency responses. And I think the question before us and before these scholars is, are you going to solve the real problem, or do we just kind of let these Band-Aids fall off over time? And then there are things that were broken during the pandemic, and I'm concerned that they will stay broken. So some of the hardest things to address for people, and this really came to fore when we were trying to support people in isolation and quarantine. One was childcare and elder care. So how do we support people when their main supports became infected with COVID or needed to quarantine, or if someone just wanted to go get vaccinated, but they were the primary caregiver for a child or for an older adult who can care for themselves. Didn't hear a lot of people talking about it. Still not quite sure if we're going to have a robust response, though I have heard murmurings about really investing in kind of the home health workforce. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities have a really challenging time with isolation and quarantine. This is a broad category of individuals, but for some, there are other underlying medical conditions. The tasks of wearing personal protective equipment, of being in a confined space, requiring a lot of hands-on care make it incredibly difficult to do that effectively. And it's not something that was widely talked about. And then lastly, as a primary care provider, as someone who does integrated substance use treatment in my practice, there were not a lot of isolation and quarantine options for people who use drugs or alcohol. And there was a lot of variation across cities and how jurisdictions responded to this particular crisis. And I'll laud California for a lot of the programs they were able to promulgate. But these are a couple of populations that didn't really seem to have a voice. And I want to kind of hold these up as other potential policy points for the scholars. I knew I would go overboard on this one.
No, this is terrific and powerful look under the hood of all these problems. I think for many of us, we would have said it was about trying to create a vaccine, and then sort of miraculously that happened quickly, as these things go, trying to figure out how to then roll it out and get it to people. Obviously, that is an important part, but you just rolled out, I don't know, I lost track at about a half dozen major issues that were not that, some of which I don't think I would have put in the health bucket, but you did in a very powerful way, and I think they really captured that. Congressman, let me pull us out of the domestic into the foreign service area of public service for a second. This is your pre-congressional career, although obviously you continue to be involved in foreign service issues as a member of the United States Congress. But in your pre-congressional life, you were at USAID, the State Department, the Pentagon. Many of our public service scholars are interested in careers in foreign service of some kind or another. Can you walk us through a little bit how you found those jobs, how you got those jobs, what you found rewarding about them, what you found challenging about them? And same question I've asked Paul and Amanda. Where are the skills that you would recommend people interested in foreign service? What are the skills they should be thinking about adding before they graduate and as they start their careers?
Yeah, you know, with the work in foreign policy and working government, you know, what I'll say is it's very important to not think about it as a monolith. And I think that was something that I struggle with. I think I kind of came into it thinking just like, oh, I'm going to work in the government, and like, which department do I want to be at? What agency do I want to be at? as if it was kind of like a menu of options. And what I didn't understand, and having worked in so many of these different departments and agencies, is that they have very different cultures, very different experiences. Even within the State Department, working in a regional bureau like the Middle East Bureau, or working in the what's called a functional bureau, which is like the democracy, human rights, and labor. They're very different cultures. They're very different experiences too. So that was something that I wish I knew beforehand. I wish I had some sense of how to navigate that, what the landscape looked at. The other thing that I think it's important to have an understanding of, but it's hard to accomplish this without actually just working, which is why I think internships and other types of opportunities are important, is for me, the fundamental question that has allowed me to be successful in the work that I do and find reward in is this question of what kind of work satisfies you? What is it that actually makes it such that you can come home at the end of the day and just kind of say, you know what, today was a great day. Today was a great day of work. And I think it's important for us to kind of document that. I think it's important for people to keep track of the things that really excite them. And it doesn't just have to be like the day that you got to work at the White House, or the day that you got to go visit this or that, but like even just like in some of the more regular tasks that you have, what are the things that you find rewarding and what are the things that not? And that's okay to not like certain things. It's okay for, that was helpful for me throughout my government career to say, you know what, like this kind of work in government, not really the thing I want to do like this. And it allowed me to kind of focus in and get better. So in that kind of combination of learning about the landscape and learning more and more about what it means to work at the Pentagon, what it means to work at the State Department or USAID and the different bureaus, and then what kind of satisfies you, then you put the Venn diagram together. Then you start to understand where is that overlap. And yes, it's hard to know that from the outside. And look, like when I first came down to DC, I remember I got off the bus at Union Station and I realized that I knew 0 people in the entire city. Like it was not a city that I knew anybody in. I don't come from a connected family. I'm a son of immigrants, now married to an immigrant. It's not necessarily something where I felt comfortable. I didn't know my way around. I didn't even realize there was like a metro system in DC. I knew nothing about the city. And but what I did learn is that that people in government often love to be able to talk about themselves and talk about their jobs. So I got to go out and just ask people, what's your job like? I'm intrigued by what you do. Like, I want to learn about what you do. And sure enough, they'll kind of, find time to talk to me. And that kind of mentorship, as well as just ability to kind of learn and to find people whose jobs I thought were interesting, things I might want to do. And I would talk to them and understand how they got there, understand how to kind of maneuver that. And that mentorship became key. I'm where I am now because, 4 or 5 mentors that really looked out for me, not only in terms of being a sounding board, but keeping their ear out for potential opportunities and giving me courage when I was worried about things. And then I'd say the last thing I'll just say is I remember when I was thinking about working at the White House National Security Council. This was a job that I dreamed of. As I always dreamed of working at the White House and having that opportunity. But it was, part of me was just like, well, who am I to say that I could do that job? I think I was in my late 20s, early 30s. It was a lot of the other folks that do these jobs were much older. But I had a mentor that just kind of, said like, what do you have to lose? And it was just kind of this reminder to me that like if you really want it, don't select yourself out of something, and I think like too many folks tend to do that. And I think that, in DC, that can be tricky because I know, folks want to be, and I was just my first question telling you that there needs to be a lot of humility. Yes, there does. But we also have to recognize where we think we can be of impact. My first boss at the State Department had this line that I loved, which he said, you don't have good government unless you have good people working in government. And you recognize that government often sounds like it's a big machine with cogs and wheels, but it's not. It's made up of the people, and it's a reflection of the people that are working within and what their values are. But he also said you can be a good person and still have sharp elbows too. And I think that that's important. That doesn't mean you become a pushover. It doesn't mean that you kind of act quietly in the back of the classroom. There are ways that you can do that as long as you kind of anchor yourself right. So those are some of the key lessons that I learned, in terms of coming into the foreign policy space and trying to carve out a way that I can envision an actual career coming about.
We're getting some questions that are coming in. I want to plant one for the three of you to think about, because it's not fair to just zip you with this at the end. So the last thing we're going to do before we break, I'm going to ask you each to give us one or two books to add to our summer reading list. This is Phi Beta Kappa after all, and we are big on reading lists, book lists. So I'll give you some time to think about that. And we've got a couple of questions that I will call the overcoming barrier to entry questions. So let me just read off a couple, and then and whoever wants to jump in first. One is one of our students asked the question about you can get really good experience with internships. A lot of those internships are unpaid internships. Not everybody can afford an unpaid internship not to make money during a summer or as a part-time job in school. So do you foresee any changes in that landscape and how that particular skill set can be made available in a way that fits with people of different kinds of financial circumstances and needs? Related question, and it's one that Congressman Kim was just alluding to or talking about, but precisely, how do you get a foot in the door when you don't have any connections? Who are those mentors? Where do you find them? If you go to mentor.com, that doesn't help. So how do you start to build your own network of mentors, and how do you overcome those barriers to entry to public service to get a foot in the door? So whoever wants to grab onto
I'll jump in real quick. It's I think it's a shame that there are so many important unpaid internships, because that really does cut a lot of people out. But there are still opportunities. Volunteer in a political campaign, volunteer on an advocacy issue campaign. Do that. Get a job if you can find a job, and then do this on the evenings or do this on the weekends. It's a lot of life. I can't remember who the quote is, but 90% of life is showing up. Show up and people recognize that you're doing a good job. People don't stuff envelopes anymore, maybe in political campaigns, but show up and say what you thought about what the candidate had to say or what you're hearing in your neighborhood. Give your input and you'll rise to it. The other thing, just real quickly on mentorships, I love talking to students, and I think most professors do. So, and I'm sure since all of our folks here have been successful, but don't be afraid to do the office hours or the student hours or whatever they are. I love hearing student stories. It's one of the things I finally figured out is there's only so much I can accomplish if I can help inspire others or advise others or motivate others to get out there and make a difference on issues. That carries a lot more clout than anything I can do alone. But it means that you've got to reach out and contact those professors first too. They make great mentors.
I'll just jump in real quick. First of all, I completely understand about the internships. I mean, this is something that prevented me from being able to do a lot of government work. The only reason I was able to get my foot in the door with an internship, which was at USAID to start, was because I was lucky enough to win a scholarship called the Truman Scholarship, which then had a program that they would give you at least a room to be able to live in DC. So that would kind of took the edge off. And there are different programs like that. And I think maybe we can find a way to kind of catalog some of the different ways that people can get help and support. So if that's something of your interest, I'll certainly work with Phi Beta Kappa and others to try to make sure that you have that. But there are certain efforts underway to be able to support that, both from within government and outside of government. Those are very important. And look, it was helpful for me because I was able to take that internship at USAID and turn it into a paid job at USAID. And start to make some connections there. Went off to grad school, but because I had that foundation and that work experience in DC, I was able to come back and use that to have opportunities to do other things. But it's tricky, and there's no beaten path to this. There's no kind of manual on how you do that. In terms of identifying and finding mentors, you're right. There's not necessarily or folks that are there's not necessarily sort of a structured program necessarily. I remember I kind of dug through kind of like alumni lists of folks from the schools that I went to that were working in DC, things like that. But I do have to say, I did kind of just reach out to people kind of out of the blue, that had certain jobs, and just kind of very upfront say, I'm not looking for a job right now. I just, informational interview, and people were pretty generous with their time. And I ended up staying in touch with them. And some of them, maybe not necessarily became mentors, but there were people that I could kind of reach back out to. The mentors for me were people that I had worked with, people that had seen me and what I am made of and what skills I bring, and people who I trusted and people who I admired. That kind of deeper relationship is one that doesn't come to everybody, and I feel blessed that I've had a couple of those opportunities, and I certainly try to pay it forward as best as I can. But, I think, not to, just don't be shy and letting folks know that you're interested in that kind of experience and that kind of approach. I think you'll find that a lot of people are actually in some ways kind of flattered that people would want to seek their advice and learn from them. And I think most people in government know that it's not an easy career. And it's not necessarily one where the rewards come through, high paying jobs or other things like that. So people understand that, we try to, when we see people that are talented, we want to keep them in. So I think that's something that I think I'd encourage people to do.
Yeah, that don't be shy advice is actually important advice. Benjamin Franklin is supposed to have said, to make a friend, to ask a favor. It sounds counterintuitive, but people who've been successful in any field, but particularly public service, are flattered to be asked. And if you send an email, they don't answer, nothing's been lost, but you might make a contact that way. Amanda, I wonder if I can take you in a particular direction of, first of all, the questions about your choice of degrees, which was to twin your medical degree with an MBA rather than an MPH, a Master of Public Health. And then sort of a related question, was there something in your medical studies that directed you in a public service direction, or how would you explain the arc from medical school in the path that you've taken rather than in a clinical practice or a hospital practice?
Yeah. So to the question of what complementary education do you want for your medical degree, I think it comes down to a combination of personal interests as well as what is your theory of change about the world. So, for me, based on how much satisfaction I got from being on sports teams and running student groups in high school and in college and directing plays in elementary school all the way up through high school, I found that I wanted to continue to develop my leadership skill set in a very particular way. And then when I thought about, how I in particular was going to make an impact on the profession of medicine, there were some people who would think that change will happen because of your ability to impact the behavior of large populations of people. And yes, that is true. And those people should go get an MPH because they're going to be able to apply their passions and their skill set to that theory of change. There are those people, these wise people in this group here, who believe that change will happen because of the work of government institutions and because of policy. And I wasn't that person at that time in my life. Clearly, I appreciate it so much more now. But for me, I thought that the way that change would happen in medicine and the ways that I want to see was being able to create organizations that worked well, both on the macro level as well as the functioning of an individual team in a particular clinic or a particular medical unit. And then the ability to recruit, retain, manage, and motivate a diverse staff of professionals to deliver on the promise of what healthcare can achieve. That's what really got me. And I found that type of training was going to be best accomplished by getting a general management education and obtaining an MBA. And I solidified that inkling by actually taking time off in between going to college and then going to professional school. So I worked for an industrial supplies distribution company, talk about an arc, I did information systems. I learned about supply chain management. I learned about a lot of things outside of medicine. And I said, oh my goodness, I love our approaches to problem solving. I love all of the people that I'm getting to work with. I just wish we were working on healthcare challenges. And so I think that kind of imprinted a lot of the ways that I, deliver presentations today, and my interest in quality improvement. And I think those are the things that really excite me about the work in medicine. At this point in my career, I am focused on the pandemic, the vast majority of my time. But when I was serving as interim CMO, I was working a lot in the nitty-gritty of healthcare finance and operations. And in doing the care models work, I find that I can apply some of that design thinking training and some of that storytelling that I talked about before to promoting the work of care models. So I found that it has worked for me. And the nice thing about it is we now have a group of thinkers who weren't all trained in the same discipline. So I'm surrounded by plenty of public health people. And one of the great things about the test and trace core and our pandemic response is I got to really see what excellent public servants are like and how exciting it is to work with them. And it's nice to be able to bring a little bit of managerial experience, talk to people about inventory management, just bring another perspective to the conversation.
Paul, talk to me a little bit about how one handles frustrations. And what I'm thinking about in particular, I mean, it's a topic that we can't not touch on tonight. You've been deeply involved in gun violence. Your work in the Brady Institution. Here we are again talking about gun violence in America. The last few months have been devastating. The president just talking about this within the last 24 hours. We were saying before we went live on the air, you were saying so much of this had this deja vu all over again feel, that you heard things that you talked about years ago. How do you keep on keeping on an issue that you clearly care deeply about, where progress just seems to be really hard won?
The whole gun violence prevention issue is so frustrating, and I don't. Honestly, it's hard for me to understand why. I mean, there are some hot button issues out there where, if you believe life begins at conception, it's hard to find middle ground. I mean, some of these things, but on the gun violence issue, there are very few people that think everyone should be able to have any kind of a gun. There are very few people that think that there should be, or think realistically that there could be a society with no guns. So we've got this middle ground where you ought to be able to agree, what sort of people, what sort of people should be on the prohibited purchaser list? What sort of guns should be treated differently than others? What sort of places might we not want to take guns? There's areas, actually, it's in Scalia's decision in DC versus Heller, where he says this right, like other rights, is not unlimited. He outlines areas where you should be able to sit down and reach some agreement. And I know when I took over the Brady organization, I wrote the head of the NRA and said, I'm new here, willing to meet anytime, any place. You're, with staff, no staff. Never heard back from him. Only when I debated him on TV occasionally, when I raised the issue and he wouldn't answer it. But it's an issue. I would wake up every day thinking I'm fighting for the side of the angels, and every night I'd go to bed thinking I've been knocking my head against a brick wall. And you just got to keep going on. It's the people that are the most persistent, and persistence is crucial, are families who have suffered directly from gun violence, and they stay with it. And that's why when I was at Brady, and still the activist groups at Brady with Everytown, Moms Demand, are so crucial across the country. They're the ones that are contacting elected officials in their districts and saying, we've been impacted by gun violence. We know people that have been impacted. Do something about this issue. So persistence from those who have suffered directly is crucial. I think talking to everyone's crucial too. When I was at Brady, I would go on Fox and Friends or any Fox news show, any chance I got. And my staff said, you're stupid. They're going to trash you beforehand. They're going to treat you badly when you're on, and they're going to trash you afterwards. And I said, if I can't make that our argument to the folks that are watching these Fox News shows, we're never going to have any success on this issue. So I would do that all that I could. I would go to Second Amendment rallies. I would debate and still debate gun rights activists across the country, because I think it's important for people to hear the issue and to hear different sides of the issue. So, let people know what's going on. The other thing is to get information out there. This is where the gun rights crowd has been brilliant. They have made it for years. They made it basically impossible for CDC to look at gun violence as a public health issue, which is what we should consider it as, to do any research there. They've got basically a bill a law that provides pretty tight immunity for gun manufacturers and gun distributors. So anytime the issue comes up, people say, well, this didn't work, this did work. And you can't really answer it because there's so little information. So, having people that are persistent, having people that can talk to others, and having people that are willing to dig out that information, we should treat this as a public health issue and a public safety issue, not as a partisan political issue. And I'm going to keep trying on the issue. And I think every year we get a little bit closer, but it's going to still take some time, and it's going to take some effort from everyone who's out there.
Amanda, good example of obstacles overcome on your path where it wasn't, it only looked easy in retrospect. It didn't feel easy living through it.
Yeah, so great question. I would say probably the first obstacle to overcome from, growing up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and having a lot of the experiences, within my family, in my neighborhood, that pushed me into this career in healthcare, but that was very much about public service. It was just overcoming kind of like the low expectations and condescension of others. So the, either outright derision or that's so cute to a young woman of color who wanted to become a doctor and wanted to go to these schools and wanted to pursue this education. So really being able to steel yourself against those microaggressions and not let them cut you down one by one. Has been part of it. I think that on a kind of more professional level, just really being able to define the path and actually being able to opt into a career that allows me to be an eternal generalist is one of the things that I love about primary care. And I think it's one of the things I love about working in a big city is that there will be so many issues to take on that I'll constantly be able to teach myself, learn new things, and apply those lessons to solving different problems. I think to this point about internships earlier, there was a lot of concern about my future financial stability that weighed on me as I took this plunge of going to certain institutions, committing myself to many years of training and wondering would I ever be able to pay off the debt. And I think that, the closer you are to the process, you understand what levers are available to you and the things that you can take advantage of so that you're not left with a situation that only perpetuates the wealth disparity that we have in our country. I think that I do have to make choices. So I love that I get to practice medicine, teach residents, work on the systems level. So I know that the frustrations I encounter in practice are things that I can actually impact. But I've chosen not to be a researcher. I said that, hey, this is not how I'm going to define my career in medicine. And then I think trying to do so many different things while it allows me to lend a unique perspective and a multifaceted perspective to problem solving. It's only possible because I have a great care team in clinic that I can collaborate with, and an amazing executive assistant who can help me stay organized, having great deputies for various programs who I can trust to keep the operation running as I think about kind of what is the next program and how to assemble resources for the next initiative that we're going to take on. And these are not things that people necessarily taught me explicitly, but they've been wonderful assets that have come together along the way.
So we're coming down to our last couple of minutes. So I told you I was going to come back for book recommendations for the book list. So let's go back to our well, actually let's unwind the order. We'll go opposite order this time. So Congressman Kim, what should be on our Kindle this summer?
So what I'll say is I'm kind of making my way through anything that Ron Chernow has written. I've been just a huge fan of his work. Whether that's the Grant biography that I'm working through or Washington. I actually had the chance to be able to meet him. He was telling me that he's working on a new book about Mark Twain, and I'm sure it's going to be extraordinary. But someone who can, really kind of bring that history to life. And I guess not to mention Hamilton, which obviously then became a blockbuster sensation. And it was funny hearing him talk about him advising the Broadway musical and how to bring that to life. But yeah, those are the things that just kind of help remind us that our leaders at every level of government are human, and they are people that are very real, and people that we should, admire for some of the things that they've done, question, some of the other decisions that they made, and try to learn from it. But it just humanizes these figures that I've looked up to, and helped me kind of understand that, we're all just trying to figure this out. That nobody, again, has all the right answers.
Well, and someday, some future Ron Chernow will write a biography of Andy Kim, and we'll
it'll be
find
very
out.
boring.
Oh, I don't think so. I don't think so. I already know what the opening scene is going to be. It's going to be that moment after January 6th. You inspired a whole generation. You have no idea the impact you had. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Amanda, what should we be reading?
Yeah, so I hope I'm not dating myself too much by this offering, but I think one of the most provocative and eye-opening books I read, this was probably post-high school, early college, was Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States.
Oh,
and
yes.
I think the reason that this was such a powerful book for me was during kind of high school and maybe even early college, had inklings that I wasn't getting the full story, that there maybe was this baked in degree of complacency that was used to sanitize my education. I think reading that book reminded me that people have always been protesting, and people have always been dissenting, and not to quiet that voice that speaks inside of you and is letting you know that something's wrong and something has to change. We don't talk about them. It's probably for a reason that we don't let people know that we've been having small revolutions on an ongoing basis in this country, and we should be continuing to do more of that. You want to have a sense of what Howard would write about you during this time.
Yeah, Howard Zinn at Boston University was a major voice for what if we turn the mirror around? What if we look at history from a different way? What if we put new voices into it? I don't want to say it seems passé now, but it sort of seems it seems expected now. When he did it, it was breathtaking, and I think many of us had the experience of reading that book, and every page was a wow. Yeah, finding the work of the people who bring new voices in and keep that wow experience going. Okay, Paul, pressure's on.
Yeah, they stole all my answers. Along the same line, I mean, there's so many good histories and biographies, autobiographies out there. Jill Lepore wrote a good one a couple years ago called "These Truths," a one-volume history of the United States that looks at some of the big themes that tie into these truths. From the Declaration of Independence, are we meeting those goals or not? The biography, the Chernow biographies are great. Grant really was good. I think that's the best of those of the Washington, Hamilton, and Grant. That was the top one. The David McCulloch obviously has also got good biographies. John Adams, Harry Truman were both excellent. The Robert Caro's books on LBJ are amazing. I was not a fan of Lyndon Johnson when I was younger. I went from being a Goldwater supporter, so I didn't like him for that, to being an anti-war protester, so I didn't like him for that. But reading the Robert Cato books is amazing. Master of the Senate.
Master of the Senate is one of the great political biographies of all time.
And when we look at the dysfunction that Congress has now, I mean, it goes through, I mean, he does things. The Republicans are against him, the Southern Democrats are against him, and somehow he gets things done. And then the next volume where he's lobbying for the civil rights bill after JFK's been killed, behind the scenes, laying the groundwork to get that done in '64 is amazing. He was an amazing politician, obviously had some major flaws, but really you learn a lot from the books. Last one, I read Obama's first volume for his presidential autobiography, Promised Land. It was excellent. It's I really like the way he writes, and you get a lot of what he's thinking when he's making some decisions, and sort of the difficulty in a lot of these things that we don't always appreciate too. So you can learn from all of these.
Paul Helmke, Amanda Johnson, Andy Kim, thank you all so much for spending your time with us, sharing your experiences with us. Thank you on behalf of a grateful nation for all the work that you have done and continue to do, and to continue to inspire us, and to all of you for being with us for this program. Thank you for joining us for the Call to Serve, the Key into Public Service convening. Thank you all. Stay safe.
Enjoyed it. Thank you.